Actually, for those in attendance, I do have candy at the front, and there's a purpose. If I ask a question and you actually answer correctly, you get candy. And if I see you dozing off, then I might throw candy at you, right? And I've never saw you dozing off, and I have to admit, you're always alert. Better.
Topics for today.
Transfer disclosure statement. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming today. So we have an exciting subject lined up. I think some people are in here because they thought the discussion on tax was occurring today, but it's not. So if you made a mistake, that's okay. Yes.
That's one of the people.
So next week, remember Monday, we actually have CC Robles, who's in charge of the MLS and professional standards, going over the code of ethics. So please, that'll be Monday morning. Odd time, I understand that, but it's difficult to get her pinned down on a time frame. So I had one of 12 choices distributed among 30 different people. So I took that. And then Tuesday will be a discussion on taxation, not given by me. So that's the good news. Today's discussion is in regards to the TDS. I think we all take the form for granted. We do have it up on the screen, so it's being projected for you to see. It's required by Civil Code Section 1102. So that is the reason we use it, because it's statutorily required. It requires, I'm going to just go over the basics of it first. Requires a seller of residential property with 1 to 4 dwelling units, including personal property, mobile homes, or manufactured homes, to provide a buyer with a specified form. And that's the TDS, and it satisfies those requirements. And we say it's statutorily defined, it means that the form must contain certain specific or exact language, and the form does accomplish that. And then it indicates, actually the TDS law indicates that if there's any material disclosures or changes to the TDS or subsequent to delivery of the TDS, the buyer has a 3-day right of rescission if delivered personally, or 5-day right of rescission if delivered electronically. We'll go over that also. And then it also indicates that neither the seller nor real estate agents are liable for any error or inaccuracy, provided they had no personal knowledge. I will talk about that. But if you have knowledge that something is not accurate on that form and you should be reading it, then you could actually have liability, unfortunately. And then the person that's to provide the TDS to the buyer is the agent who has obtained the offer. And that is the selling agent, right? The agent representing the buyer. And you'll see that on some forms, and sometimes it's a question that arises. So the person that obtained the offer is the person who's representing the buyer. And let's see, and then a rescission of a sale cannot occur if the TDS was now provided. So let's go through the details of it. So the form itself, we have it up on the screen. Section 1 provides space to list additional existing disclosure reports. Now, I don't know if everybody can see me, but a couple of things when you're completing it, you should be indicating the date of completion, the date that you actually completed, not you, the seller. So fill that in. Then you can see there's a couple of choices below that. Inspection reports, if you'd like to attach any reports that you or the seller has obtained, you can do so here. And then the big question comes down to no substituted disclosures provided by the seller. There's no reason that we would not check that box. We are not providing substituted disclosures to take the place of the TDS. I have not come across one transaction where that has occurred, as a matter of fact. And then if we move down, Carlos, I would appreciate that. To the next page, please. One more page. Okay, thank you. Now, when the seller signs here, the seller is attesting to all the information found above. The second signature required by the seller and the agents It's just indicating that they have received the form. That's really what that form is accomplishing for us. And then we do use the AVID. You can see actually on this page, if the agent who's representing the buyer completes this, right up here as a matter of fact, that complies with the law. But we do request that you complete the AVID, and there's a number of reasons for doing that. It gives us a more methodical way of walking your property and noting any visual material defects. So if you have a 1-bedroom condo, and we know that, a 1-bath condo, I think on a TDS, or on the AVID, there's 4 bathrooms or 3 bathrooms for notation purposes. If there are no rooms that exist, type in NA. If you see something or you don't see anything that's material, you should state no visual material defects, because that is your obligation, visual material defects. If there is a carpet covering the floor, you should say it's covering the floor and it was thus not inspected, because you have no obligation to move anything. And then this is key. The TDS law applies to transfer by sale, exchange, installment land sales contract. And what is that? That's just a purchase that's prorated or deferred over a period of time, nothing more than that. A lease with an option to purchase, or ground lease, coupled with improvements of real property, and also residential stock cooperatives. And we'll see that type of property in Laguna Woods, as a matter of fact, improved with 1 to 4 dwelling units. It also applies once again to mobile homes, personal property or not. And then, is the TDS required for mixed use properties? Yes, it is. So it's actually the presence of residential property of 1 to 4 units that dictates whether or not the property is subject to using a TDS. That's what makes it, that's the determining factor. Even though maybe the primary use may be commercial, if there's 1 residential unit in there, that's the determining factor. If it's 5 or more residential units, a TDS is not required. It's not required for vacant land, also commercial or industrial property. Any questions about that? Okay. And then, are there exemptions? And this is a big question that comes up often. A perfect example would be a traditional housing tract in which there's a public report. So they are exempt. You can also file for an exemption, which would be rare to obtain. Also, exemptions occur associated with court-ordered probate sales. Also, if it's by foreclosure, or this is the biggest question that comes up, transfers by a fiduciary in the course of the administration of a decedent's estate, guardianship, conservatorship, or trust. So in the event somebody has a revocable trust and the property is transferred into their revocable trust, if they have occupied the property, or if they own the property, actually still through their trust, they have an obligation to provide a TDS. If the person that owned the property transferred that property into their revocable trust now dies, and the person who's administering the trust, the trustee, if that person has lived on the property during the last year, an exemption does not exist. But if the trustee of the trust has not occupied the property during the last year, and assuming they're not the ones who originally owned the property, an exemption exists. Or there really aren't that many exemptions from the TDS. So what does that mean if it's an LLC, a flipper? Those all require providing a TDS. It doesn't matter if they live in Vermont and they never sell the property. They have an obligation to provide the TDS if they bought it. Then also transfers between grandchildren or direct descendants, between spouses, or if in the event of a divorce, for example. And then your obligation, no matter if the property is exempt or the seller is exempt from providing a TDS, what is your obligation as to inspection of the property? Anybody? Are you required to inspect the property?
Yes.
No. Okay. The answer is yes, you're required to inspect the property, regardless if it's if there's a residential unit of 1 to 4 units, you're required to inspect the property. How about for sale by owners? Does the seller have to provide a TDS? Two people, sorry.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. I think I caught Sarah off guard there.
Yes, also.
Sarah's sitting only 3 feet from me, so it's not fair when I'm throwing it as hard as I can. So yes, your obligation is to inspect the property if it contains 1 to 4 residential units, 5 or more, no. Let's see, and then how about new homes? Maybe there's some infill projects sometimes, or we see somebody, a builder that bought a property and they tear it down and they build a new home. Are they required to provide a TDS? That's correct. Yes, they are. Sarah? You can afford to put some weight on, Sarah. And then who fills out the TDS form? The seller, absolutely. Nobody else but the seller. And if you try to complete it, right, it's not going to allow you to do that. Good catch. Wow. So if you click on it in zip forms, it says seller 1 to complete. All right, that's what happens when you click on the boxes there to complete it. And then what happens if the listing agent or selling agent, or what should the listing or selling agent do if the seller refuses to complete the TDS? Well, you should tell them that, oh, you got an answer. Yeah, but if you tell them and then they refuse, then what?
They still have to sign.
Well, that's a good idea. We want to get that. So we want acknowledgement of that. But then if so, you should notify the seller that through the close of escrow, the buyer can cancel the transaction. Doesn't matter if all contingencies have been removed, the buyer can cancel the transaction. And there's case law in which a property management company owned or actually managed a property on behalf of an entity or seller for 3 years. The seller never provided the TDS, and the day before the close of escrow, they canceled. And then it was appealed, and they won again in the appeals court. So it shows you the strength of the TDS.
So the buyer can still cancel?
Absolutely. So you should make the seller aware, and if you're representing the buyer, I'd say at any time, if you're representing the buyer and the seller refuses to provide disclosures we have requested, we should notify the buyer of that. Then that's all you can do, right? But you want to notify, if you're representing the buyer, notify them of that fact.
And this is even after removing all contingencies.
Even after removing all contingencies, if the seller doesn't provide it. So oh yeah, there's no reason not to, as a matter of fact. I think, and if you're the listing agent, you're remiss in regards to not having it completed. Or now, what happens if you find out the TDS was completed incorrectly? If you're aware of an error, you've got a fiduciary obligation to the client. So you should notify them. It's really what you should be doing. So what does that mean for all these disclosures? You should be reviewing the disclosures.
Yeah. I have a question of the date. Sometimes I've come across agents providing TDS, which was dated, for example, like a month and a half or 2 months ago, for example. How far they can date it back, because they got the listing, they got all the papers basically right in front of the seller. They fill it up and then they'll hold on to it. And then 2 months later, they provide whatever it is.
Yeah.
Like, what's that?
There is no stale date. What the defining factor would be from the seller standpoint or the agent standpoint, if anything has changed. If they're claiming that no changes have taken place during the last 6 months, they have no obligation to amend it.
So what happens if you leave the same, you have to create another?
If you do what? No, I mean, because in your case, we decided to cancel and restart the listing again at some later date. No,
So you can still use the old?
you may,
Okay.
absolutely, assuming nothing has changed with the property.
Sweet. Application for
The disclosures that the seller has completed, if nothing has changed, you don't have to update anything or just send it to them for a new date. But it's a reminder to them, these things that are stale dated 6 months, has anything changed in the property?
So what if the seller just signed it, nothing, he wrote it?
is that acceptable?
No, no, if the seller just signs it, if they don't have anything to disclose, maybe they should say never occupied the property, never saw the property. If that's the best of their ability to complete it, then I guess, but the question would come down to if there's a completely blank form, did we just insert that form in front of the seller in a blank form? And that's what they're gonna do. They're gonna say, hey, they had me sign this without even having me complete it. So I don't think I'd be reticent to accept something like that if there's nothing on there. And if they know nothing, then they should write, I know nothing about the property. Yeah, it's those are violations, or ethics violations also in regards to the ongoing issues that we always face, which you're sick of me hearing saying.
And it's the same as not provided, so I can cancel anytime?
Yes. Actually, remember, once the TDS is provided, if it's provided to the buyer, personally, me handing it to the buyer or the agent, because the agent has a fiduciary duty, there's a 3-day right of rescission. And then if it's sent electronically or via mail, it's a 5-day right of rescission from the date it's sent. Now we think, and remember, contracts theoretically under the premise of good faith. Now, could someone contest the cancellation? Possibly. So that, in my opinion, they should have a valid reason, even though the TDS law does not mandate that you have a reason.
So if you've noticed some parts of the form that have not been completed fully, and then you notify the agent that explanation is missing on F or G or whatever, and they haven't responded to that, can you still, like, even though they provided the TDS and you've notified them and no updated TDS has come through, can you still back out?
I think that's a good question that probably I couldn't answer clearly. Is it complete? So that's the first aspect of it. Would we consider that complete if certain questions are not answered? Maybe somebody can make that assertion. And that completion also includes you completing either page 3 of the TDS or attaching your AVID. Without that, the TDS once again is not considered complete and the rescission period remains open. So if it's not complete, because the law states it's supposed to be complete, then I think it's fair to question whether or not we're extending the rescission period. And it could be argued that because it wasn't delivered complete, there are 3 questions that were unanswered, then maybe that does extend the rescission period. And then if there are issues that you come across that you believe are incorrect before delivering the TDS, you should address that with the seller, ideally have them correct it. And then if you discover, or the seller discovers after delivery, then you should have them complete a new or amended TDS, write amended across it. Seller should re-sign. You have no obligation to re-sign. But then again, delivery of that is opening up the rescission period. And even if it's not put on the TDS, if there's a subsequent seller disclosure and not provided through a third-party report, that opens up the rescission period. So it doesn't have to necessarily be in that form. But if that subsequent material disclosures through a third-party report, regardless of who paid for it, that would not open up the rescission period. So we can be careful about that. So I think the real question is that the seller, or issue is, I should say, the seller nor the real estate agents are liable for any error or inaccuracy in the disclosure form, provided they had no personal knowledge of the error or inaccuracy. Or if maybe they came to their conclusion based upon a public agency, an expert in the field, those would be valid reasons. But I think if you're sitting there and it's questioned, why is this completed improperly? And there's a mistake. Well, did you read it? No. Why not? You have a fiduciary obligation to the client. Or if you did read it, you know you're going to make the changes. So it's, if you're aware of something, even if you don't read the disclosure, in my opinion, because the disclosure is presented improperly or with an error in it, you could have culpability. So read the disclosures. And in reload companies, that's something else we see periodically. A reload company has never occupied the property, or the transfer occurs just before the close of escrow of your transaction. So the reload company still has an obligation to give you a TDS. They should attach the prior owner's disclosures. So that agent who represents the seller and the buyer, they should all be sure that even though it's going to be a reload company transaction, all the disclosures should be complete. And from that former seller, they should be sure that they attach that and give that to the buyer. But the problem is with the seller, if the seller doesn't provide those disclosures, there's case law in which they sued the seller, not the reload company, for non-disclosure.
So in that case, they would be providing two TDSs, the one that the seller gave to them and then the one that they're.
Yes, good point. So the reload company, for example, will provide a TDS and attach to that the prior owner's TDS. That's what I would do. Let's see.
Would they have a valid argument if they were to say, we provided you what we received and that should suffice, we're not going to give you another one? I mean, is that?
Well, if I think we can make an assumption, reload company is going to say on their TDS, we know nothing about the property, never occupied, and that should put the buyer on notice. But when they reference the attached TDS from the former owner, I think that they have complied with all disclosure obligations. So they're passing on any information that should have made them aware of the condition of the property.
That's not a liability.
Yeah.
Seller.
If the seller doesn't give those disclosures, then the seller could have culpability. That's a problem.
Yeah.
And it's been proven to be that way. And then remember, it's the agent who's representing the buyer that must deliver the TDS. If you're double ending it, it's your obligation. And it doesn't have to be delivered in person. No, not necessarily. And then something that I recommend often on page 16 of the purchase contract, we talk about the designated delivery address. Please use that, especially with the opposing party. We want their designated delivery address because when you send anything, it's deemed to have been received by the other party. So there's never any question whether or not delivery actually occurred. So what about a lease option? Done very few of those. When should the TDS be provided? Before the buyer enters into the lease option. And then in terms of providing the TDS, what if I were to provide the TDS to a buyer before they entered into the purchase contract? After the contract is accepted, do they have a right of rescission? Anybody? The answer would be no, assuming there's no subsequent material disclosures made. So if the TDS is delivered before the contract is executed, the right of rescission is no longer available.
Well, once the return is signed, right?
I'm sorry, what?
Once they return it signed, executed, then there's no right of refusal.
Well, no, delivery.
Okay, so you.
I would say delivery because, and that's why I use a designated email address. That person, that agent for that buyer is considered to be a fiduciary. So delivery to that fiduciary is deemed to be delivery. So it doesn't mean they have to sign and return it, but I certainly would get it signed and returned. So there's never any question.
So then does that no longer fall under the 17 days to review disclosures?
It doesn't anyways. It's a separate and distinct, it's the only rescission period or aspect in the contract, unless somebody were to write in another rescission ability or the ability to rescind based upon another event. So it's the only aspect in the contract in which rescission is available. So I think that's the question is the contingencies and the TDS are in a sense separate and distinct. Remember, if you remove all contingencies and then thereafter now receive the TDS, the rescission period has opened. Rescission cancellation would be another term. And actually, would you go to the very bottom of the last page, Carlos? It talks about rescission right here. 3 days after delivery. That's if in person, and obviously 5 days if mailed or sent via electronically. And then can a buyer waive their right to receive the TDS? No, they can't. No, we haven't talked about that. And then, of course, if the seller provides a TDS, do they still have the obligation to provide other disclosures? Yes, they do. What other contingency in the contract is not waivable by a buyer within 10 days of the date of execution of the contract? Federal lead-based paint. Fun fact, right? And then remember, a couple of things that always come up. Are you obligated to provide a TDS if the property is sold as is? And the answer is yes. As is does nothing to relieve the obligation. And many times we see people writing in the words as is, it's already in section 7B1 of the purchase contract. And it really has no bearing on anything. And then are sellers required to complete a separate smoke detector and water heater bracing compliance form? No, they're not, because page 2 has the language in there. So if a TDS, if somebody's exempt from the TDS, then we would need that separate disclosure. And then also it talks about carbon monoxide devices. Carbon monoxide devices are not a point of sale requirement, even though it's required by law. TDS says that they have to provide compliance if something's required by law. And the contract requires compliance or installation of carbon monoxide devices. So just like water conservation and plumbing fixtures, even though it's required by law, it's not a point of sale requirement. And neither are carbon monoxide detectors a point of sale requirement, even though it's required by law. I don't understand what that is. If it's part of law, don't you seem like you have to comply? Well, you're just making the statement that it is in compliance.
It's required for a loan, right?
Yes, the lender's going to require it. That's exactly what's going to happen. Good point. And then under section 16, the TDS, it's talking about, yes, lawsuits. It's talking about much more than just lawsuits. Now, realistically, if we look at the SPQ, it talks about past, present, or pending litigation. So there's another area in which litigation is referenced. But the other thing it talks about would be claims. Now, is a claim litigation? No, not necessarily. If you've ever worked with a builder, the builder usually has, or they're obligated under statute to have a non-adversarial aspect that's available or required actually between the parties. Let's say, for example, that the buyer makes a claim that there's a construction defect. So there's a non-adversarial process that the parties must go through. So with that said, it's asking about that information also under California Civil Code 914, excuse me, 910, 914, and 900. So that's what it's talking about in regards to other potential claims, not just necessarily litigation. So construction defect is probably the best analogy I can give you in regards to understanding what that means. So keep that in mind when you're working with somebody who has a new home and they're selling that property. Do we have any questions? No, it's quiet, huh? So it's a lot more than just completing the form. A couple of other things. It talks about, let's see, item 2, features of the property. Shared in common with adjoining landowners. Most of California has walls, and usually those walls are shared by property owners. And I don't think sellers read that close enough. So we see a lot of issues or errors associated with that. And then room additions 4 and 5 are really important. Structural modifications or alterations made without necessary permits or not according to code. Those are critical aspects in regards to completing the TDS, by the way. And then sometimes we see people not even checking the box in regards to it, whether or not they're involved in the HOA and their CC&Rs. So just because there are CC&Rs doesn't mean that there's an HOA. So you should be looking at the prelim to confirm that information. That should tell you that. And then if you go to the very last page, Carlos.
How uncommon is that, Rich, that if there's CC&Rs that there's no HOA?
I don't think it's common, but it certainly does occur. You know where we see a lot of it? Down in Newport, there are duplexes. And many times those have CCNRs, but there's no management company. Yeah, yeah, it
So
is.
who enforces the CCNR? Is the city?
No, it's between the two homeowners.
The two that correct.
Yeah, that-
Created it, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
Anyone that's on title, it's between them. So that can involve insurance, maintenance of the building. There can be questions that come up about properties like that. There are no rules and regulations. There's just a CCNRs. Older areas also, I've noticed that in San Clemente, there are certain areas that have CCNRs, but not necessarily a management company.
But the opposite is true. If there's an HOA, there's always CCNRs.
I would say yes, yes.
So that all sellers know they have a CCNR?
Will they know? I don't, well, the seller should know. I think that sometimes they're just not aware because they think that I'm not paying an HOA fee, then I don't have CCNRs. It's just because they're CCNRs doesn't mean that you're paying monthly dues, because there is no established management company. So they may not be aware.
So they
So
are always on the prelims.
it's always on a prelim. And who should be reading the prelim besides the seller? You. Yeah. Let's see. And then let's see, I think those are some of the more critical aspects, as a matter of fact, or HOA association, which has any authority over the subject property. And it could be a PUD. Code of the cause is a good example. You don't have a direct management company, but you do have an overall management company. I think that's true probably in almost all of Irvine too, as a matter of fact. You could have sub-associations, but then the master also. If you go up to the very last page, please. So, section 3, the sellers actually, I'm sorry, a little farther down, is attesting to all the information, including confirmation of being in compliance with the smoke detector and water heater bracing, and talking about the carbon monoxide detectors also, and water conservation and plumbing fixtures. Doesn't mean the property is in compliance.
So it's this, right?
Yes, exactly. So that's what the first signature block actually is for. And then remember to have delivery of a completed document. The agents must sign and they must complete their inspection or refer to the AID, which should be attached. And then the very last signature blocks, it's confirmation that there's been delivery of the documents. So that's exactly what's taking place in that form.
The signature is often missed.
All right, so then there isn't confirmation that it's been delivered. Getting to your point, should I make sure they sign it? Well, you should, right? We should make sure they are signing it, acknowledging that it was delivered. So I don't know if anyone heard that, but Carlos said in many cases, and he would know better than anybody, many times the seller isn't signing.
I think in zip forms, I'm not sure with the new version, but with the old version, it doesn't automatically put a signature block in there. And I think that's why people are missing it.
And the reason why is because they theoretically shouldn't be signing this section until everything above it is complete. That's why it's not allowing you to sign. It's trying to prevent you from signing a blank document, or at least with things that are not complete. That's a good point. Thank you for bringing that up.
So how should we handle it? Should we have everything signed first? Have the buyer
We should.
and then send it back to the seller to sign?
Yeah, that sounds like the ideal world, doesn't it? If it were my transaction, I don't think I would be waiting, actually. I would just try and get their signatures. I would manually insert the signature. That's probably what I would be doing.
So you guys out there in Zoom, make sure that you add that signature block in there when you're sending this out for signature, because it doesn't automatically add it for you.
All right, so we got a couple of people that noticed that. Any questions? No? Okay.
Not a question.
A
but
statement?
related to CCNRs or the HOA docs. You were talking about that earlier, and that some people, like for example, buyers, when they receive it, they expect us to read through and then tell them exactly what's going on. But I've been telling them, no, it's not my responsibility. It's your responsibility to read the whole thing because you're going to be living there, not me. But there's nothing that I can notice that it's like standing out to me. But is that our responsibility to rate the HOA and CCNRs, or we should just let them do the homework, basically?
I think that's a very good question, and I think what I would do, I would always offer to go through all the disclosures before they sign any acknowledgement. That's would be my approach. But make sure that you say, okay, I'm ready to go through these. Let me know when you want me to go through it. So, and you probably have heard the example. I'm gonna unfortunately have to use it again. But on this property in Laguna Canyon, everything was delivered. The buyer received all the disclosures, including the CCNRs. And in this particular property, the CCNRs had a restriction associated with an work artist live unit. You had to be someone who met the requirement of the city to be classified as an artist and you don't have to live in Laguna Beach, but you have to be an artist. So it had that restriction in terms of occupancy in the CCNRs. It also had within the real property report for the city of Laguna Beach, a reference to a conditional use permit. When drilling down, it also talked about the occupancy restriction. And that also could be found on the preliminary title report referencing the conditional use permit. So then obviously the buyer moves in, the buyer finds out that he really can't live there. Now the buyer's saying, not only is the listing agent and the seller obligated to make restitution to me, but you, Coldwell Banker Platinum Properties, you represented me and you didn't tell me. As a matter of fact, we went to the extent of saying that the documents you're signing, they're no different, they're benign. That's the word. So using that one word, giving characterization to those documents, that was the conflict that put us in jeopardy, which we ended up settling. We're almost done settling. But do you have to read it all? That's a good question. I would say it's difficult to read it all.
So you say don't ever tell the buyer that this is just standard information.
Don't characterize anything. Your characterization should be every disclosure I'm providing you is critical. And you should read every single page. And then the other thing in this example, talking about the disclosures, the seller in the seller property questionnaire affirmatively said there are no occupancy restrictions. There's check boxes on the third or fourth page. And so with that said, maybe we should have been aware. It's possible, but even the listing agents weren't aware. The seller was aware. No question, they just decided not to disclose it. So do we have to read every single word? I would say that's not reasonable. That would not be the standard in the industry.
But we weren't the only ones, right? There was another unit.
No, that's the problem. We were, there's 9 people involved in that litigation, 9 entities.
Property, right?
Yes, yeah, we weren't the only ones, right? Unfortunately, if we didn't use the word benign, then our exposure would have been really minimal. I think for the CCNRs, which probably there's a couple of things. Parking, that's always an issue for people where they can park. And then also with a condominium, it's probably more prevalent. Identifying the assigned parking spot. I think to me, that's very, very important. You want to make sure that the spot they think they're getting is a spot that they're legally entitled to, because sometimes there's side deals between tenants or occupants saying, oh, pay me $50 or we'll exchange. Well, let's make sure that the assigned parking spot is the one they expect to get. And then we've even had one example between 2 upstairs units. There's a storage space dividing the 2 units. And the one neighbor who was so pleasant and nice was allowing the neighbor who was moving to use that storage space. Now that's identified in the condo plan. Then our buyer found out after the fact, oh, that's really not my storage space. So what I would do, I review the budget. I want to see if the budget is under or overfunded. Usually I see funding to be well below the recommended amount. So that's something to point out to somebody. What does that mean? It's well below, or it could be a special assessment coming. And then I would look at all the minutes. That's very simple. You can see if there's any discussion about any potential special assessments or changes in regards to the HOA dues.
Rich, in a situation like that with storage or a parking space that someone swaps or sells to someone, is that something they can do, sell it to someone, and then what would happen? They'd record it, they deed it to them, like how does that work?
Well, I haven't come across that. Let's put it that way. I would assume anything's possible. But then that would be a part of the prelim. So we would hope that they did it, that it was recorded, as opposed to somebody is paying somebody, giving them some type of a tenancy or creating a tenancy. And obviously we want to make sure that it's done before we close the escrow, but
If it's recorded, it would be the best case.
it would be the
scenario.
best. You would know exactly.
Yeah. So with condominiums, I actually see it a lot in Long Beach where it's in the legal description of that unit that you have parking space 1, 2, 3. But then somewhere along the chain of title, there's a swap or a purchase of an addition.
Oh, so you witnessed that.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Not so much in Orange County, but we may start seeing it because of our high rises. But I see it in a lot of the condominiums along Ocean Boulevard in Long Beach, because I think when the builders were selling them, there was different price tags on how good the spot was or how many you got. And we have seen people making outside deals, but that is the best case scenario. Otherwise, you have.
You
to
won't
go-
know.
You won't know. And
So
the
what's the
HOA
instrument they're
documents-
recording? What's the document they're recording?
It's probably some type of a grant deed, right?
It's a grant deed.
That's sort of a grantee.
And then if we don't read the prelims, I understand that. You're gonna give, whether or not you have any culpability, you'll be drawn in. So that's always the issue if we can avoid that.
That's the risk of loss.
Oh, it did. Okay.
Let me, on my
I have
computer.
one question.
Mm.
Problem on this side and the smoke detector. There is this problem that the seller must provide this walkable
It's,
before the selling.
that's negotiable who pays for installation of the smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors, but it's the seller who's stating that they are in compliance with the law, that they are installed, and contractually also. It's requiring, as I said, the smoke detectors, excuse me, the carbon monoxide detectors are not a point of sale requirement. Smoke detectors are. So that has to be done before the transaction closes. Carbon monoxide detectors, it's required by law, and a contract goes to the extent of requiring it before the close of escrow. But they can decide who's going to pay for that. Same thing with the water heater bracings. All those things are negotiable. Who pays?
The smoke detector.
Yes. Yes. So the other, you can, if you're representing the seller, you can structure the contract such that the buyer's paying for those things. It's just the seller's obligation to sign the certification that the property is in compliance.
You're still on, but this.
Oh, am I? Okay, all right.
Form is not on.
Does anyone else have any questions? No? Okay. Well, it's good to see you. Thanks for coming, everybody, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you for